It was a Sunday evening, the 4th of December 1977. In the world of commercial aviation, this was meant to be unremarkable. A simple, short-haul flight connecting the Malaysian peninsula. But in the annals of air travel, this date would be etched in history. A grim, terrifying marker that exposed the fragility of human safety and the shocking deficiencies of a security system living in the past. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH653, a Boeing 737-200, a workhorse of the sky. The flight was scheduled to take off from Bain Lapis International Airport in Penang, destined for Kuala Lumpur's Subang International Airport. The distance was short, the flying time barely an hour. For the 93 passengers and 7 crew members, this was nothing more than a commuter trip. The atmosphere on board was light, almost festive. It was early evening. People were returning home from weekend trips or heading to the capital for business. The passenger manifest, however, was anything but routine. On board were several high-profile figures. The Malaysian Agricultural Minister, Dato' Ali Haji Ahmad, the head of the Public Works Department, Dato' Mathis Khalid, and even a prominent Cuban ambassador, Mr. Mario Garcia in Castagay. The fact that the flight carried such critical diplomatic and political figures would only heighten the later crisis, turning a local incident into an international security nightmare. The flight crew, led by Captain G.K. Ganjoor, was experienced and professional. At 7:21 p.m. local time, Flight MH653 gracefully took off from Penang, climbing into the twilight sky. The first 15 minutes were textbook. Ascent, leveling off, the routine ping of the seatbelt sign being turned off. Flight attendants began their service. The passengers settled in. This feeling of routine and security was about to be shattered. The unexpected turn, reports from the cockpit. At approximately 7:54 p.m., as the 737 was cruising at its assigned altitude, things changed. Not with a bang, but with a sudden, chilling urgency in the voice of a man who is fighting to maintain control of his aircraft and his fear. Ground control in Kuala Lumpur, monitoring the flight, suddenly heard a strained transmission from Captain Ganjoor. It was fragmented, chaotic, and completely out of protocol. Captain Ganjoor, MH653, we have an unidentified passenger. He is threatening to take over the flight. The words hung in the air of the control tower. The silence that followed was deafening. This was the moment the flight's trajectory, both literal and figurative, changed forever. The plane was being hijacked. Reports from the cockpit: a hijacker is on board. Panic begins to unfold, but the situation was immediately confusing. Hijackings were not unheard of in the 1970s, but they usually involved clear demands, communication, and negotiation. This situation was different. The communication was sparse, laced with fear, and gave no indication of the hijacker's identity, motives, or demands. Who was this person? And more critically, how did he get a weapon on board? The answer lay in the terrifyingly relaxed security measures of the time, a failure that would be exposed brutally in the next hour. First signs of trouble. a distress call and trajectory change. The panic began to unfold not just in the cockpit, but in the control tower. Control tower recordings from that night captured the increasing desperation. The plane's transponder signal, which had been tracking steadily toward Kuala Lumpur, began to behave erratically. The radar showed flight MH653 performing an unexpected 180-degree turn. It was flying back toward its origin, or perhaps just aimlessly over the water. Pilot distress calls. Captain Ganjour's voice returned, but this time it was clear that the hijacker had taken the initiative. The pilot was no longer in command. The transmission was punctuated by shouting and what sounded like a scuffle in the cockpit. The crew was fighting for their lives and the lives of the passengers. The unclear command. The pilot seemed to be speaking under duress, saying that the plane was under the control of a Japanese Red Army operative, or something to that effect. But the information was immediately suspect. Was this a forced statement? Or was this genuinely the hijacker's identity? The confusion only compounded the crisis. The immediate change in trajectory meant the flight path had become unpredictable. The ground response was paralyzed. There were no clear protocols for this level of in-flight violence and misdirection. Air traffic control could only watch helplessly as the plane flew off course. Ground control's paralyzing situation. No clear demands. Without demands, there could be no negotiation. Unverified threat. They had no confirmation of the weapon or the hijacker's true identity. Lack of contingency. Malaysia had no military protocol for scrambling jets to intercept a domestic hijacking, especially one happening so fast. The military and civilian authorities were unprepared for a crisis of this nature. This catastrophic lack of preparedness wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a systemic flaw. The entire security infrastructure of 1977 aviation was built on trust and low expectations, a vulnerability that a single determined violent person could exploit with horrifying ease. The ensuing chaos in the cockpit was a direct result of the systemic failures on the ground. Failures that began the moment this unknown individual was allowed past security with a weapon. The frantic struggle in the cockpit, captured only partially by the raw, crackling radio transmissions, was the terrifying prelude to one of the most inexplicable air disasters in history. They were no longer flying, they were fighting, and that fight would end not in a safe landing, but in an utter disaster over the vast, dark mangrove swamps of Tanjung Kupang, Johor. What was standard in 1977, and where were the critical gaps? 1. Passenger screening, a critical gap unlike today. Universal passenger screening was rare, pre-flight protocols, examining airport security measures of the late 1970s in Malaysia. Many smaller, regional airports like Penang's Bayan Lepas often relied on random checks or visual profiling. The metal detector technology was bulky, expensive, and not universally implemented, especially for domestic travel. Passengers often walked directly from the terminal to the gate with minimal to no physical check. The belief was that the threat was always external, not internal. This created a gigantic, gaping hole. Lack of technological investment. Airports in the region often prioritized throughput and efficiency over security due to cost constraints. The few metal detectors that existed were often older models, easily bypassed by insulating a small weapon or exploiting dead zones in the archway. The training deficit. Security personnel were frequently undertrained in recognizing suspicious behavior or conducting thorough pat-downs. Their primary directive was often customer service, not counterterrorism. The psychological profiling that is standard today was virtually non-existent. 2. Baggage security. Checked baggage was rarely screened by X-ray technology, which was still in its infancy. Carry-on luggage received only cursory visual checks. If any, a firearm, a knife, or even an improvised explosive device could easily pass through security tucked into a coat or a small bag. The unattended bag problem. The concept of an unattended bag being a threat was not widely recognized. A hijacker could have checked the weapon through as a piece of standard luggage, only to retrieve it later, or even have the weapon already planted in the aircraft by an accomplice before the plane took off from its home base. 3. Crew and staff access. This was arguably the largest security breach point. Crew members and airport staff were often exempt from rigorous screening. Their access was based on trust and identification badges. If the hijacker was an airline employee or a confederate of one, the weapon could have been bypassed entirely through staff entrances. A chilling vulnerability that often came to light in later hijacking cases. The power of the ID badge. An ID badge in 1977 was a virtual free pass. It allowed access to secure areas, catering trucks, luggage handling, and even direct aircraft entry without the same level of scrutiny applied to a standard passenger. If the perpetrator was a disgruntled former employee or someone who had illicitly obtained a staff ID, the ability to sneak a weapon onto the plane was dramatically increased. The political environment. The focus of security was largely on preventing baggage theft or controlling access to the tarmac, not on detecting a determined, violent individual bringing a weapon on board. The prevailing mindset was that a domestic flight was relatively immune to the serious threats facing international carriers. This complacency was the true weak link. The sum of these deficiencies meant that the entry point for the weapon was almost certainly one of complacency. The hijacker did not have to be a genius. They only had to be determined and aware of the critical gaps. The mystery of the weapon, speculation on oversight. The official investigations into MH653 were severely hampered by the lack of clear evidence due to the catastrophic nature of the crash, which we will discuss in Part 3. However, security experts could speculate on the potential methods and oversights. Method 1. The personal weapon, the simplest oversight. Given the lack of metal detectors, the hijacker could have simply carried a standard, easily concealable firearm, like a revolver or a small automatic pistol, tucked into their clothing. The lax physical search protocols would have ensured it went unnoticed. The flight was short, meaning the hijacker was highly confident in their ability to gain immediate access to the cockpit. Method 2. The inside job, the most chilling possibility, the high-profile passengers on board. including a Cuban ambassador and the Malaysian Minister of Agriculture, suggested a target of political significance. If the hijacker was targeting the political elite, the operation might have been more sophisticated. The weapon could have been delivered to the hijacker by an airport accomplice, a ground crew member, or even a catering staff member who had unimpeded access to the aircraft prior to boarding. This theory gains traction when considering the possibility that the hijacker's identity was politically motivated. The political dimension added layers of complexity and urgency that the local police were simply not equipped to handle. Method 3. The explosive device, the unseen threat. The terror of a bomb is that it leaves little evidence behind. If the weapon used was an explosive, it would explain the total confusion and immediate control seized by the hijacker. Explosives detection technology in the 1970s was virtually non-existent for everyday airport use. A compact, disguised bomb could have been carried on board with ease, guaranteeing instant leverage over the crew. The confusion over the hijacker's demands might suggest the threat itself was the primary leverage, allowing the assailant to bypass protracted communication and negotiation. The frightening conclusion reached by subsequent safety boards was that the hijacker had a near certainty of getting the weapon on board. The mystery of the weapon. How did a firearm or other weapon get past security? The security system itself was the enabler of the crime. Lack of contingency, paralyzed on the ground. When Captain Ganjour's distress calls finally reached Kuala Lumpur's Subang Airport, the ground response was nothing short of disastrous. Was there a clear, immediate protocol for handling hijackings at the time? The answer was a resounding no. The lack of contingency planning turned the crisis into a catastrophic fumble. 1. Decision paralysis and ambiguity of authority. Air traffic controllers were trained for weather emergencies, mechanical failures, and navigational issues. They were not trained to negotiate with armed hijackers. This led to immediate decision paralysis at the control level. Who was in charge? Civilian air traffic or the military? The lines of authority were blurred, causing critical delays. The military hesitated, requiring multiple levels of political clearance before scrambling jets. Clearance that took precious, fatal minutes to obtain. The civilian authorities, meanwhile, could only monitor and attempt communication, feeling utterly powerless as the crisis escalated out of their domain. 2. Military response failure. Unlike the U.S., which had protocols, though often imperfect, for intercepting hijacked aircraft, Malaysia lacked an immediate, well-defined military protocol for domestic air piracy. The Royal Malaysian Air Force was slow to scramble any interceptor jets. By the time any military aircraft were airborne, they were flying in the blind, relying on increasingly erratic radar data. Every minute of delay handed absolute control to the hijacker. The failure to launch immediate, decisive action was a direct consequence of a nation's strategic blind spot. Three, the apparent unpreparedness of ground control. The air traffic controllers, unable to establish two-way communication or clear demands, could only relay increasingly confusing and terrifying audio fragments to the authorities. They were reduced to passive observers of a disaster unfolding in their airspace. Their attempts to contact the cockpit were frantic and ineffective, leading to frustrating loss of control. Psychological impact on ATC. The lack of a script or training manual for this specific type of sudden, violent crisis left the controllers operating on raw stress and instinct. This mental fatigue and fear meant their professional clarity diminished rapidly, compounding the communications problem. 4. The miscommunication trap. There was confusion regarding the hijacker's identity. Was he Japanese, a Red Army member, or simply a desperate criminal? The unverified information led to miscommunication among different security agencies, diverting attention and resources toward political motives that may or may not have been accurate. This miscommunication trap consumed precious minutes, preventing a clear, coordinated action plan. 5. Lack of negotiation training. No resources were deployed for a trained negotiator. The crisis team relied on untrained personnel to attempt communication with the hijacked plane, a critical tactical error that may have agitated the situation further. In the absence of an experienced negotiator, the crew was left alone to manage a high-stakes hostage situation with no external support. The failure was total. The hijackers had exploited the security gaps to get on the plane, and the authorities' failure to develop a unified, swift response ensured the situation would not be resolved through negotiation or intervention. The cockpit under duress. The ultimate price of this systemic failure was paid by the crew and passengers of MH653. Captain Ganjour and his co-pilot were in a battle for survival and the lives of those behind them. The intermittent radio transmissions suggested high levels of violence were occurring in the cockpit. One unsettling audio snippet suggested that the hijacker was either highly agitated or highly intoxicated, adding an element of dangerous unpredictability to an already volatile scenario. The flight path, seen on the radar, was not a deliberate, controlled maneuver, but a desperate, erratic struggle. A terrifying airborne tug-of-war between the trained crew and the armed, unknown assailant. It was the final, tragic realization. The ground had failed them. The only chance for survival was in the hands of the besieged crew, fighting against overwhelming odds. The security nightmare had now fully unraveled, setting the stage for the descent into chaos and tragedy that would define the final moments of Flight MH653. The descent into chaos and tragedy. The security nightmare of the ground had now been fully realized in the air. Flight MH653 was no longer an aircraft. It was a ceiling coffin tumbling through the night sky, its fate decided by the violent, desperate confrontation in the cockpit. Communication breakdown. The final desperate struggle after the initial, frantic distress call at 7:54 p.m. Communication from MH653 became sporadic, confused, and increasingly desperate. The transcripts of the final radio communications, though incomplete and sometimes obscured by shouting and static, paint a harrowing picture of escalating chaos. Ground control was straining to hear the voices of Captain Ganjour and his co-pilot, but all they received was a chilling mix of professional pleas and violent intrusion. Captain Ganjour, MH653, we have an unidentified passenger. He is threatening to take over the flight. But the professionalism quickly dissolved. Later transmissions shifted from the procedural English of air traffic control to desperate Malay, a signal that the formality of control had been abandoned in favor of primal, immediate communication between the crew members or between the hijacker and the pilot. The shift in language was a powerful psychological marker. It meant the crew had gone past the point of following international protocol. They were now operating under extreme duress, trying to communicate critical, immediate survival warnings or pleas that transcended the standard aviation lexicon. This change confirmed to ground control that the situation was no longer negotiable, but immediately life-threatening. The final known transmissions were marked by a terrifying escalation. 1. The sound of struggle and incapacitation. Ground control reported hearing audible shouts and what sounded distinctly like a physical altercation. This was not a controlled hostage situation. This was a fight for the yoke and the throttle. The sound suggested objects being broken or torn apart, indicating that the hijacker was actively attempting to incapacitate the crew or destroy flight equipment. The high-profile passengers likely made the hijacker extremely volatile, determined to maintain absolute, brutal control, leading to this sudden burst of violence. 2. The gunshot and the fatal silence. Unconfirmed but widely reported accounts from the investigation later suggested the possibility of at least 1 or 2 gunshots being fired within the cockpit. This single act, if true, would explain the sudden and catastrophic loss of control. A bullet hitting pilot, or worse, hitting critical flight instruments or wiring, would instantly seal the fate of the plane. Crucially, the sounds of shouting were followed by a sudden, profound silence on the transmission line. This silence, after the burst of violence, was the most definitive sign that the cockpit crew had been fatally incapacitated. 3. The loss of electronic identity. At approximately 8:08 p.m., the flight's transponder abruptly went silent. The beacon, which identifies the plane on radar and its altitude, was gone. The plane had become a ghost on the screen, visible only as a primary radar return. A dark, silent object hurtling through the atmosphere. The electronic death of the transponder signal was the final, terrifying signal that all human communication and control had been severed. The aircraft was now nothing more than a slave to physics. Loss of control, the final moments of terror. The transponder silence marked the beginning of the end. Now flying blind and without communication, the plane began its sudden, uncontrolled descent. The aircraft was last sighted by primary radar at an altitude that quickly deteriorated from cruising level to below 3,000 feet in a matter of seconds. The speed of the fall was catastrophic. Atmosphere in the cabin. The phytics of panic. Inside the cabin, the passengers and remaining flight attendants would have instantly recognized the terrifying change in pitch and speed. The sudden, violent negative G-forces of the uncontrolled descent would have thrown passengers against their restraints, or worse, sent unbuckled individuals flying through the cabin. Loose items, catering carts, and debris would have become lethal projectiles. The violent pitching and banking meant that the flight was no longer controllable, creating a horrific sensation of freefall combined with extreme centrifugal force. Atmosphere in the cabin. The physics of panic. Inside the cabin, the passengers and remaining flight attendants would have instantly recognized the terrifying change in pitch and speed. The sudden, violent negative G-forces of the uncontrolled descent would have thrown passengers against their restraints, or worse, sent unbuckled individuals flying through the cabin. Loose items, catering carts, and debris would have become lethal projectiles. Violent pitching and banking meant that the flight was no longer controllable, creating a horrific sensation of freefall combined with extreme centrifugal force. The sensory overload. The sounds would have been overwhelming. The piercing shriek of the airframe under stress as the plane exceeded its structural limits, the roar of the engines in a steep dive, and the collective, primal screams of 93 passengers suddenly facing their final moments. The brief, flashing lights of the emergency lighting would only highlight the sheer terror on every face. The uncontrollable descent. The Boeing 737 is built for stability, but no plane can recover quickly from a struggle in the cockpit that likely involved incapacitated crew or a destroyed flight yoke. The plane was in a terrifying spiral or a nosedive loss of control. The sudden, uncontrolled descent of the aircraft and the terrifying last moments for those on board, accelerating toward the ground at immense speed. The crew, if conscious, would have been pulling the yoke with all their strength, their last act being a futile battle against a plane already doomed by the violence unleashed moments earlier. The final 30 seconds. The last few moments were a blur of sensory overload. As the ground rushed toward them, the crew, if conscious, would have been engaged in a desperate, final attempt to pull the nose up, to regain control, to issue any warning. The radar track confirmed the aircraft was at a near vertical pitch in its final second. The sudden silence on the radio confirms the effort was futile. It was a race against gravity that the aircraft was losing at an accelerating rate. The inexplicable crash. Tanjung Kupang, Johor. The flight path ended abruptly at approximately 8:15 p.m. in the rural fishing village of Tanjung Kupang, Johor. The impact was cataclysmic. Due to the high speed and the steep angle of the descent, the Boeing 737 crashed almost vertically into a remote mangrove swamp. The sheer force of the impact meant there were no survivors. The plane disintegrated upon impact, burying itself deep into the soft, muddy terrain. This location, remote, dark, and difficult to access, compounded the tragedy, severely delaying immediate rescue and complicating the recovery of evidence. Investigation challenges and the muddy grave, the hostile environment. The crash site in the mangrove swamp was a nightmare for investigators. The soft mud swallowed large sections of the wreckage, and the tidal water contaminated evidence. Recovery teams faced difficult terrain, dangerous wildlife, and the relentless humidity, significantly impeding their ability to map the debris field accurately or recover bodies intact. The mystery of the black boxes. The search for the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder was a desperate race against time and the elements. When the recorders were eventually found, the discovery was both crucial and agonizingly frustrating. The FDR provided data on the plane's final, uncontrolled movements. However, the CVR tapes were inexplicably blank after the point of the hijacking, a critical, frustrating mystery that remains unsolved. This loss of the CVR eliminated the most vital source of evidence, the final recorded conversation and sounds within the cockpit, leaving the exact sequence of the struggle to speculation. The severity of the crash made finding definitive evidence impossible. Based on the final radar data, the physics of the crash angle, and the witness reports, investigators narrowed the probable cause to 3 terrifying possibilities. 1. A violent struggle and incapacitation. The most likely scenario is that the hijacker and the crew were engaged in a struggle that resulted in a weapon being fired, fatally wounding or incapacitating the flight crew. With no one at the controls, the plane spiraled into a steep, unrecoverable dive. This aligns with the abrupt transponder silence. 2. Intentional action. Suicide by hijacker. It is possible, though less likely, that the hijacker, realizing the military might be approaching or that his demands would not be met, deliberately placed the aircraft into the fatal dive. This would suggest a suicidal, politically motivated motive rather than a simple extortion attempt. The extreme violence observed in the transmissions supports a mind capable of such final, destructive actions. 3. Catastrophic mechanical failure, secondary to violence. While the 737 was robust, the intense violence and possible gunshots in the cockpit could have damaged critical flight controls or hydraulic lines. This secondary failure caused by the hijacking event would have made the plane uncontrollable even if the hijacker had been subdued, leading to the ultimate conclusion that the crisis itself caused the structural failure. The official conclusion, based on the limited evidence, pointed toward crew incapacitation and the aircraft losing control due to the violent interference of an unknown person, the hijacker. The true, agonizing details of those final moments, the sounds, the terror, the desperate last words, were permanently swallowed by the swamp and the static of the empty CVR tapes. The tragedy of MH653 was a culmination of human failure, systemic gaps, and a single act of violence. It exposed a brutal truth. In the 1970s, aviation security was a facade, and a determined individual could turn a routine flight into a mass grave with horrifying speed. The shockwaves of this crash would not only devastate the victims' families, but would fundamentally transform aviation security worldwide. The silence that fell over Tianjin Kupang, Johor, after 8:15 p.m. on December 4, 1977, was the silence of total devastation. The Boeing 737 was gone, vanished into the thick, treacherous swamp. The investigation began immediately, but it was fraught with challenges and ultimately left a trail of unresolved mysteries that continued to haunt Malaysian aviation history. The human cost and recovery efforts. The immediate aftermath was defined by the profound human cost. The crash was so violent that the 100 people on board, 93 passengers and 7 crew, were instantly killed. The high-speed, near-vertical impact into the soft ground resulted in the complete disintegration of the aircraft and the bodies within. The recovery nightmare. The location of the crash, a remote, tide-affected mangrove swamp, made recovery efforts agonizingly difficult. Rescuers and investigators had to navigate deep, viscous mud and dense vegetation. The search was not for survivors, but for any recognizable remains and crucial wreckage. Lack of identification. Due to the extreme fragmentation, official reports confirmed that no single body was recovered intact. Aftermath and lingering questions. The human cost. Remembering the victims and the profound impact this tragedy had on their families and Malaysian aviation. The subsequent forensic investigation was limited to recovering fragmented human remains, making individual identification extraordinarily challenging and deeply painful for the families. Ultimately, a mass burial ceremony was conducted for the unidentified remains, a somber acknowledgement of the sheer violence of the disaster. Political impact. The loss of prominent political figures, including the Minister of Agriculture, Dato' Ali Haji Ahmad, sent shockwaves through the Malaysian government, compounding the sense of national loss and immediately elevating the disaster from a simple crash to a major national crisis. The emotional impact on the victims' families and Malaysian aviation was profound. The nation was forced to confront the vulnerability of its air travel system and the reality of a threat that had previously seemed distant and abstract. The investigation's findings. The inescapable conclusion. The official investigation into Flight MH653 was led by the Malaysian Department of Civil Aviation, DCA. Despite the hostile environment and the frustrating lack of the CVR recording, which had become blank, the investigation eventually produced a formal conclusion, the official conclusion. The official reports firmly concluded that the accident was caused by the loss of control of the aircraft due to the unlawful interference of a third-party crew incapacitation. The key finding was that the cockpit crew, led by Captain Ganjour, was incapacitated, likely by the use of force, possibly a firearm, by an individual believed to be the hijacker. Loss of command. Following the violent altercation, the aircraft was left without skilled human control, leading to the rapid, unrecoverable descent into the swamp. Security lapses acknowledged. While the report focused primarily on the cause of the crash, loss of control, it implicitly acknowledged the catastrophic failure of pre-flight security that allowed the assailant and their weapon onto the aircraft in the first place. The report was a quiet condemnation of the then-existing security protocols. Unanswered questions, the lingering ambiguity. Despite the formal conclusion, the official reports left critical aspects of the hijacking and crash shrouded in ambiguity. Unanswered questions continue to fuel speculation and theoretical analysis decades later. 1. The identity of the hijacker. This is the biggest mystery. The alleged initial transmission mentioning a Japanese Red Army operative was never fully substantiated. No member of the JRA ever claimed responsibility for the act, nor was anyone officially arrested or named as the perpetrator. Who was the hijacker? A political fanatic? A disgruntled employee? A solitary criminal? The official report offered no definitive answer, stating only the presence of an unlawful interference. 2. The motive. Was the hijacking an act of political terrorism aimed at the high-profile passengers? Was it an attempt at extortion that went fatally wrong? Or was it an act of self-destruction, suicide by hijack? Without a clear manifesto, demand, or confession, the motive remains completely unknown and speculative. 3. The blank CVR tape. The finding that the cockpit voice recorder tape was blank after the onset of the crisis remains an enduring source of frustration and suspicion. Theory 1. Intentional erasure. Could the hijacker have destroyed the CVR tape during the struggle to conceal their identity or motive? Theory 2. Technical malfunction. Could the violent power interruption or severe airframe damage caused by the struggle have caused the CVR to stop recording or the final tape section to be damaged beyond recovery? The blank tape ensures that the most direct evidence of the final moments of violence and terror will never be known. The exact sequence of events. While incapacitation is the likely cause, the precise sequence of the struggle, who fired the gun, when, and whether it was a deliberate act of destruction or an accidental discharge, remains speculation. Was the pilot killed first, or did the plane start to spiral before the crew was incapacitated? The official investigation, though thorough under the limitations, ultimately provided a conclusion based on the result, loss of control, rather than the precise cause, the identity and actions of the hijacker. This ambiguity left a legacy of doubt and unanswered sorrow for the families who never received full closure. The unseen legacy, a scar on Malaysian aviation. The tragedy of MH653 left a permanent scar on Malaysian aviation. It was the first fatal hull loss for Malaysia Airlines and its first ever hijacking. The shocking security lapses that enabled the disaster became the driving force for immediate and radical change. The aftermath forced authorities to reckon with the horrifying vulnerability of their air travel system. The lack of preparation, the ambiguity of command, and the realization that a basic security check could have prevented the entire disaster led directly to a major overhaul. The memory of the 100 victims, particularly the high-profile citizens, served as a grim, persistent reminder that air travel security was a non-negotiable imperative. The lessons learned from the chaos of MH653 were not confined to Malaysia. They contributed to the growing global understanding that aviation security required a unified, militant, and technology-driven approach. The crash closed a dark chapter defined by complacency, but it opened a new, urgent era dedicated to vigilance and technological advancement. The disaster served as a terrible yet effective catalyst for the sweeping changes that would eventually transform global aviation safety. The fire of Flight MH653 extinguished 100 lives, but it ignited a long overdue revolution in aviation safety. The disaster, alongside a series of other high-profile hijackings in the 1970s, served as a catastrophic, undeniable proof that the global aviation system was fundamentally broken. The response, born of tragedy, was swift, painful, and ultimately necessary, transforming aviation security. The immediate overhaul of the tragedy forced Malaysia and the international community to radically reshape airport and airline security protocols. The immediate changes focused directly on correcting the catastrophic lapses exposed by the MH653 tragedy. 1. Mandatory passenger screening. The era of walking directly from the check-in counter to the gate with minimal fuss was over. MH653 cemented the global necessity for universal passenger screening. Airports worldwide began investing heavily in bulky but vital metal detector archways, magnetometers. The acceptance of this inconvenience was a non-negotiable step to save lives. 2. Cockpit reinforcement and access control. The violent intrusion into the MH653 cockpit was the direct cause of the crash. Post-1977, discussions began to focus on hardening cockpit doors. While this process would take decades to fully implement, and would be accelerated tragically after September 11th, the MH653 incident was a critical early step in recognizing the cockpit as the ultimate vulnerable control center that required absolute protection. 3. Baggage security. The likelihood that the hijacker's weapon was in carry-on luggage or even checked baggage necessitated new protocols. Visual inspection was replaced by the gradual introduction of X-ray screening technology for carry-on items. This technology, imperfect as it was initially, represented a vital leap from relying on human observation to relying on machine detection. 4. Defined crisis protocols. In Malaysia and many other nations, the ambiguity of command between civilian and military authorities was immediately addressed. Clear, established protocols were implemented to define who is in command, usually a designated crisis team. What is the response? Immediate military readiness for interception. How is communication handled? Through a designated negotiator, not just air traffic controllers. This replaced the paralyzing confusion of 1977 with a unified chain of command. From 1977 to 2025, comparing the security landscape, the evolution of aviation security from the time MH653 crashed to the present day 2025 is staggering. The key difference lies in the shift from reactive security, responding to an event, to proactive security, preventing the threat from reaching the aircraft. This includes advancements like advanced screening, behavioral analysis, and rapid response teams. Today's security is designed not just to detect a weapon, but to detect an intent to cause harm. The constant vigilance, the enduring lesson, despite all the technological and procedural advancements, the central lesson of MH653 remains. Complacency is the greatest vulnerability in aviation security. The threat landscape constantly evolves. While the focus immediately after MH653 was on the lone hijacker with a gun, the threat today involves complex global networks, cyber attacks, and the use of sophisticated non-metallic devices. The continuous vigilance is not just about upgrading scanners. It's about continuous education and improvement in security measures. Every security protocol, every checkpoint, Every staff member represents a crucial, non-negotiable barrier against the recurrence of a tragedy like MH653. The memory of Flight MH653, the chaotic final radio transmissions, and the horrific discovery in the Johor swamp stand as a permanent, chilling reminder. A single failure in a system of hundreds of components can and will result in tragedy. The industry must never forget that the price of safety is eternal, unwavering vigilance.